Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider series. I'm so happy to have Alexandra Renner with us from BMW Startup Garage, a true practitioner of venture clienting. Alex, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our interview.
I'm very much looking forward to it too, because we had many people talking about venture clienting in previous podcasts. We even had academics who researched it talking about it. But you're the first true practitioners with many years of experience going to be able to tell us about it. But first, Alex, could you share about your journey into corporate venturing?
Yes, of course. So, actually, I think it was during my studies. I studied mechanical engineering in Munich. And we had an entrepreneurship center at the university, which is the Unternehmertum, and is actually, I think, one of the biggest entrepreneurship centers in Europe. And yeah, during my studies, I co-founded a startup um, back in 2013, and it was all about augmented reality for industrial applications. And yeah, after a couple of years, I realized, especially when I had to sell our product to big companies like also BMW, I realized that there's still a lack of experience, that I actually don't understand how this business works and so on. So I decided to make a break. So I actually left my startup and yeah, I changed to the other side and started working for BMW. The first couple of years I spent in the series development, meaning that I learned how decisions that we make or how features that we define really get into our cars, but also into our processes. And yeah, and then my former team leader asked me if I wanna bring these worlds together in a so-called venture clienting unit. I've never had anything like that before, so I was like, okay, I understand the BMW processes. I understand how or what you have to do to get into our cars, but I also kind of understand or know the founders side and the startup side, and that's why I started 7 years ago to bring both sides together. And yeah, actually, the BMW Startup Garage was the first venture clienting unit worldwide. I think many corporates worked with startups before, but we were actually the first one who streamlined that in a process where we said, okay, we have the same approach to all startups, to all problems, and we try to do this more efficient in a more efficient manner.
Very nice. So I want to talk about your first experience building a startup, because I'm sure your job requires a lot of empathy towards entrepreneurs, especially as they try to work with a big company like BMW. And by the way, I had an internship in Siemens in Munich, so I definitively understand a little bit about German culture and being precise and of high quality. So I can imagine BMW being very demanding as a first customer for a startup. So can you share about how your experience as a startup is shaping the way you engage with them today?
Well, I think what is really important, maybe the most important, is that as a startup, you see one big customer. You don't have like 20 big customers like BMW. Usually, typically, you have one. And what startups typically do is that they reaching out not like every week, they're reaching out every day. To understand what's going on, if there's something new, and how, yeah, if there's a progress on the project. But on the other hand, as a BMW engineer, you have another pace. Things are usually going slower. And when I have business units that approach me and tell me, okay, it's really exhausting to work with that startup. Why are they calling me every day? We're not that fast. then it makes it much easier to explain why they do that.
Mm-mm.
Startup world, they have a different pace and you don't have that many customers. From the other side, of, if you take the perspective of a BMW engineer, you don't have just one supplier or one project. You have typically 10 suppliers, 10 different projects, and they all need your attention. And that's super helpful to understand that pace or the different of the pace.
Actually, you're already touching on my next question, which was you spend time inside BMW, you understand the processes. During that time, did you engage with startups already?
No, absolutely not. Because it was, I mean, it was really in the serious development where you're building industrialized technologies. So you typically work with big suppliers. And what I learned is that even big suppliers, big incumbents, where you think that they understand everything, I learned that they also fail, and that's all not that easy. But it makes it even harder to convince. I would say the management, but also the engineers within a big company, that it makes sense to work with startups. That startups can be reliable as well because you already see how big suppliers fail.
I can imagine, yes, one of the challenges startups are seen as very risky
Yes,
proposition inside a company like BMW,
yes.
but actually the incumbents also have risk. It's not like they have 100% reliability every time.
Yes, absolutely. Because you usually have like one tier one supplier, but the tier one supplier has another supplier, which is a tier two supplier. And they're typically super small and not that reliable at all. We just don't see that.
So in a way, you have startups being abstracted from the proposition.
What do you mean?
You have the startups behind the tier one, so you
Yeah.
don't see the startups, but
Yes.
actually you're already engaging with startups.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That's it.
Okay. And so clearly one of the tough part of venture clienting is selecting the startups you believe will be reliable, will be adding something
Mhm.
important to BMW. Can you talk about what you've learned, the best practices in terms of identifying the startup that won't make it and the ones that actually would bring real value?
Well, in the past 10 years, there has been a quite long way for us to find the best way to identify the best startup. So when we started working, we had everything. We had startups, we had money for the business units. We approached the business units, hoping that they would be interesting in testing the startup technology, but it actually didn't work because startups were really not reliable enough, or it was too different from what many knew. And then we changed our approach a little bit because first we were pushing startups into the company. We were talking to our business units and we were proposing them startups that might be better than the business units. If you think about that from a psychological approach, it's not really smart to tell an engineer that doesn't have the best solution, that we found a young startup that's way better. So when I talk about that now, I realize, okay, it could not be successful, not at all. So yeah, so we changed our approach and we started with the needs of the business units. That means that we went into our business units. We tried to understand if there is a challenge that can't be solved internally and can't be solved by an existing supplier. And that was actually the sweet spot where we knew, okay, that's actually where a startup can provide real benefit. And the process to select the best startup is actually collaborating with the business unit very closely. So we always start with the challenge. We define the challenge as concrete, as precise as possible. And then we go out and our team scouts for startups that might solve exactly that challenge. And if you do that with, let's say, some technical KPIs or other requirements, and always together with the business unit, it's not that difficult to find the best one. And what also helps is when you meet a startup for the first time, actually like to provide them some tasks that they have to prepare in advance, so that we can discuss the results, or that the business unit can dive into a deep technical discussion. And if a startup convinces us in that technical discussion, then we actually know, okay, they know what they do, and we can rely on them that they're gonna to solve our problem.
Very, very nice. So in a way, you moved from a push to a pull, and maybe very high level. Today, you still is it 100% pull, or you still have sometimes a startup you identify, you're like, oh, this is too interesting, and still I'm going to push it.
Well, it works both ways. I would say that we have 70% pull and the other 30% are push. But still, even if you push a certain startup, it sometimes happens that the business unit says, oh, okay, that's interesting. It doesn't solve my problem. Not exactly that. But hey, let's go out and find something else. But we are still pushing because sometimes engineers don't even know that the problem that they have can be solved. So you have to think a little bit ahead.
Can I ask if, when you were pushing at the very beginning, you probably didn't have a good success ratio? But today, now that you've had these 7 years of engaging with business units, you get to understand their requirements because you have this pull mechanism. Is it possible that your success ratio when you do push a new idea is more likely to succeed than 7 years ago because you've built that intimacy with business units?
Yes, absolutely. And that's also something that we had to learn. You need a network within a company like BMW. We have so many thousands employees with possible challenges, and it's all still people business. So you need to talk to the people to be aware of the current challenges and problems, because then you can scout much more targeted and identify possible collaboration opportunities much more precise.
I love when you say people business. I think when you think about collaboration, even between a small company and a big company, most people think it's a big company, but actually it's many, many teams inside that big company.
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of how many distinct teams you're working with inside BMW?
Oh my god. Okay, so last year we had like 50 different teams we did pilot projects with, and I think around 120 that we were scouting with and where we engaged in general. Sometimes when we start with the scouting, it turns out that there's no startup or something like that. But I think it's much more than 100 teams.
Yeah. And I think for the entrepreneurs listening in, but even for people thinking about venture clienting, I think one of the biggest challenge is knowing when to engage so it intersects when it's actually valuable for both sides.
Yeah.
And it's not a big company, but there's so many different teams with different roadmap, different goals, different timing that you need to really understand to know when to engage and when not to engage.
Yeah, yeah, and it also depends on the technology, because so many startups, especially startups that I'm looking into now, many AI or agentic AI startups have solutions for hundreds of different processes. And this makes it much more difficult to find the perfect one, because you need to identify the process and the team where your solution has the biggest impact. Otherwise, you will not be able to convince your customer.
So that's interesting because let's say 50 teams for now, because I think the ones that have pilots are, I would say, qualified teams. They really work with you, they really engage with startups. So let's call them qualified for now. It's clear that with your pull mechanism, you understand their requirements. And sometimes this requirement is unique to a given team. But if you think about AI, it could be that their requirements comes across multiple teams. How do you consolidate these requirements that are maybe not quite identical, but there is a commonality between so many teams?
So actually, we do not consolidate them. We don't even do mixed product demos. So if we do a product demo with a startup, that's like the first meeting, we never mix up the business units,
Ah,
especially if they have different requirements. What we do is that we identify the use case with the biggest impact. So if I have a data analytics solution and I have one use case with maybe 20 users and another use case with 100 users, we would always start with the bigger one, with the most promising one. And then after a successful POC, this is what we actually, that's typically called adoption phase or integration or transfer, however you name it. But then we try to bring that solutions to other teams. But we try to keep it as lean as possible from the beginning on.
wow. Okay, that is a golden nugget. Because I assume that you would go with commonality, but actually what you're doing is probably way smarter, which is you go for the low hanging fruit, the most obvious that will most likely, in most likelihood, lead to a successful POC.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh wow. So you're being super lean, super sharp, where you think you're going to get a successful POC. So I'm guessing successful POC is really one of your top KPI.
It is. It is. Actually, we have two kinds of KPIs. So the one KPI is how many startups receive a follow-up purchase order. That means that the business unit decides to work with the startup without the venture clienting unit. But actually, the main KPI is how many startups actually become long-term suppliers of BMW, not for pilot projects, but really for longer engagements for several.
Okay, so it's not even about successful POC, which could stop after successful. Here, you want something to happen afterwards. It becomes a follow-up purchase order or long-term supplier contract.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, we don't measure the successful POCs, to be honest, because
I love it.
it's a KPI that you can influence quite easy. Because if you are not too innovative, you can make sure that all your POCs are successful. But if you want to do real innovations, you have to balance it a little bit and to take the risk that a POC is not successful at all.
And also, I think it's about the mission of BMW Startup Garage, which is you want this adoption, this integration of new technologies into your end products.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what you need to measure.
That's the point. And we also integrate a lot in our processes. So, especially when you think of manual tasks that we have in our daily business, there are so many solutions that you can integrate easily and quite fast, much faster than, let's say, technologies or yeah, materials into our cars.
Now, earlier you mentioned that when you started, you had money for the business group, which I'm assuming is money to run the POC. And at that point, they start to take care of it. Do you still do that or not anymore?
Not so much, actually. We had to do it to prove that it makes sense to work with startups. But when we had our first stories and when we could show that it's really a benefit to work with startups, the situation changed a little bit. So the business units started to plan to have money for startup pilots in advance. So it wasn't even that conscious that we said, okay, we're not going to finance anything anymore. It was rather the fact that we had some budget to finance the pilots, but we realized that the business units have that budget as well. So after a couple of years, it was just like, okay, we don't even need that anymore.
Now, if you were to recommending someone in the audience thinking about starting a venture clienting unit, would you recommend that they still plan for the first few years to have some money so they have no friction, they can prove the model before you go into what you're doing today?
Yes, absolutely. Because you first need to convince your internal customers. For us as a venture clienting unit, our engineers are the internal customers, and we are selling them innovations from startups. And you usually cannot sell something if you want money for that. But after you get more established in the organization and you get a better track record, then you will realize that it changes and that then you don't need the budget anymore.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Now, one thing you talk about is internal customer. So I like this because you're very explicit. The customer for you are the teams, the 50 plus teams that have pilot, hundreds plus
Mhm.
teams that you want to engage with. It's not the entrepreneur, it's not the startup. You're taking requirements from BMW and they are your customer and you're trying to find the right match that meets these requirements.
Yes, exactly.
Very nice. And so give me a sense because hundreds plus teams, that sounds like a lot of engagements and connections and meetings and calls. How big is the BMW Startup Garage?
So actually, when if you think of FTEs, because many of our team colleagues have like split positions, so they're
Hmm.
50% in the startup garage and 50% they're innovation managers for their departments. So I would say that we're around 6 or 7 FTEs.
Hmm. Full-time employee.
Exactly. And we work with external partners. So the whole scouting process, the project management, and the creation of all the documents that you need during the process is handled by our partners that are also around 5 or 6 FTEs.
Okay, so in a way, you're delegating or outsourcing your back end.
Yeah, absolutely. So the internal employees have the advantage that they have the network within the
Yeah.
company. So they're the ones who start the projects. So they identify the challenges in the business units, and then after the pilot projects are finished, it's again important to have someone who has a good network also within the
Mm.
purchasing department, but also within the business units, who can help to bring all the successful POCs to a long-term partnership.
So would you recommend venture clienting units to only recruit from inside the mothership?
Well, not only, I think it's good to have both sides. So it's actually it's important that the people that work in a venture client unit understand innovation and understand startups because still many startups fail, many innovations fail, and you need years to see the first successes. So venture clienting is, I think, not really better than investing. It takes years to see results. But it's definitely important to have people with a good network. So you should hire from inside and from maybe like a 50-50 split.
Okay. And I feel like there was maybe a secret sauce you mentioned earlier, which is a number of your teams are 50-50 with an innovation job and on the startup garage.
Yes.
Can you share a bit how you got to that and why it's valuable for others to think about?
Yes, absolutely. So the department I'm part of is actually part of the R&D department of BMW. The challenge is that we are not really aware of all the challenges in the production department or in the IT department or real estate. And for that reason, we established the Startup Garage as a platform. So, of course, we're one team, but first of all, we're one process platform. So we can all work with the same partners. We have the same lean process of onboarding suppliers or onboarding startups as suppliers and contracting them. But it is so valuable to have the people that are closer to the businesses or to the business units than us in the central organization.
Very nice. If I go back to your KPIs, so clearly you're doing a follow-up purchase order, you're looking at adoption or integration, becoming long-term supplier. Do you track the revenue contribution? Is there a way for you where you can track that, or is that something that's just too difficult?
So we do actually. It's not. I mean, it's not the only goal we pursue because, of course, one of our main goals is to bring innovations into our products, into our processes. But profitability is also one of our goals.
Mhm.
That means that not every startup project has to have an ROI, but of course, we try to calculate as good as possible. And yeah, we try to forecast this as well to get a better understanding of what types of projects we should put our focus on in the next time.
Very nice. So let me ask, I'll ask you to do two cases. One is a case where a company should absolutely think about doing venture clienting. And then the case when a company shouldn't think about it, and in which case it's not. I think the first case would be easier for you, but how would you make the case for a company why they should have a venture clienting unit?
Okay. So actually, I think I can answer in both cases.
Good. I was
So
hoping so.
okay, so let's start. I would always, I mean, you can do venture clienting for products and for processes. I would say that any company, every company can benefit of startups for their internal processes. That means automatization of manual tasks, as mentioned before, but also, yeah, typical the digitalization topics. Regarding product topics, it's not that easy because as an OEM who's typically working with many different suppliers, it absolutely makes sense to work with startups as suppliers because we are used to work with other companies or to buy products from external companies. If you are a supplier, the thing is, it gets a little bit harder because you're actually the one. Imagine that you have a team who develops an autonomous driving stack,
Hmm.
and you have, let's say, thousands of developers working on that stack, and then you try to bring in a startup that develops the same. This is actually not working because you will never have the acceptance within the team. We have that problem, or let's say challenge, also in teams that are working on electrical drives, because BMW has a lot of own experience and also knowledge in the development of the technologies. When we approach them with startups, they're typically, it's really hard for us to convince them because they are used to develop the technology on their own. So I would always look into fields where you don't develop the technology on your own,
Hmm.
where you don't have too many in-house competencies, enough in-house competencies to understand the technology, but not that much that you're going to cannibalize the in-house development.
Which is part of your learning early on.
Yes, yes, and that's what I actually see with our suppliers as well. So I'm talking to other venture client units too, and you need to make sure that the startups are no competitors of your own company.
So you're making a case that venture clienting is good when it's not when it's searching for solutions, products, processes which are not core, but close enough to the core so that the mothership can make the right decision and does the adoption integration.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And especially if you look at the timeline, if you work with a startup, you need to understand that you're maybe gonna be the first one, the first customer, but not the last one.
Mm-hmm.
That means that if you have an innovation, we can, let's say like in-car gaming, that was an innovation that we had as the first company with the startup Dream. So they created the solution Air Console. We integrated it in our cars. And 2 years later, Volkswagen had the same solution. That means that startup innovations help you to be in front or ahead of competitors for a limited time. But if you want to really have an innovation leadership that lasts for years, then you need to develop in-house competencies there, like powertrain technologies for BMW. And this is so important for BMW that we would actually not rely on a startup that has a technology that they have for so many other OEMs.
So in a way, it's an argument towards growing the core over time with sustained innovation where the company wants to go.
Exactly, especially with one, two, or three core innovations. But if you look into new technologies where you don't have any in-house competencies, then you actually have to rely on startups because either you start building up a team and developing it on your own, but then it will take ages, or you work with a startup, and then you can still start building up in-house competencies. But if you don't understand or have competencies in a field, it's always better to rely on existing solutions than to start developing solutions on your own.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a case to make it. Now I have a visual for it, so I think I can guess what's going to be your case not to do or when not to do it, but I'll let you make the case for not doing it.
Yes. So, as I said, if you are a supplier and you have like deep competency deep competencies over all levels, so a deep integration level, and you develop everything in-house, it's going to be quite hard for a startup to be integrated in your product stack. Still, we're not talking about processes, but if you have that situation as tier one supplier, you should rather think about M&A, about venture clienting before you do M&A, maybe to just evaluate a product and then buy or acquire a startup to build up a new business. And what I actually think, so sometimes I'm wondering or I'm thinking, okay, is it better for a bigger company like BMW to work with startups or actually for smaller? I think that there are different sweet spots. So if you're a startup on your own, you can also go with with a startup. But if you are an SME with very limited resources and capabilities, you should really define your strategic fields in advance. So if you look into BMW strategic fields for venture clienting, it's quite broad. But if you don't have enough resources to test new technologies, you should limit yourself and define
Mm.
what's important. Because still, most of the startup innovations fail and most of the startups do not become partners. So this is not a straightforward thing. And you need resources to test and fail and iterate.
Now, clearly, sometimes you find startups which you probably get very excited about. It meets requirements from the mothership. It looks like amazing entrepreneurs, really good. You really believe in their success. At that point, do you not wish to have like a corporate VC where you could invest in the startup?
Well, I mean, we do have a corporate VC. We're actually, it's an independent company, the BMW Ventures. And we had this case a couple of times where we did a pilot project and they invested afterwards. But still, it's not always the perfect timing because typically startups either raise a funding round or they bring their product on the market. So it's typically not at the same time,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that
yeah.
happens that we collaborate and that they're raising money. But yeah, recently, I think it was last year, the Avengers invested in a startup called Embertech. They're doing automated driving and plans for BMW. And we had the first touch point back in 2018.
Wow.
So the startup makes sure that our cars can drive autonomously through the plants where you typically needed drivers before, from one station to another or from the end of production line. And it took us a couple of years to evaluate how we can integrate them into our plans. As you know, we have many plans and the technology into our cars. But yeah, we started the first real use case back in 2021, and it still took 3 years until the Avengers invested. But also depending on that fact that the startup didn't raise money in the meantime. So
I think one of the advantage of venture clienting is you can engage when it makes sense to engage versus when there's a fundraising.
yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge advantage. And we don't have to look on the financial return that much.
Yeah. Now, having said that, one thing you mentioned earlier was a pipeline to M&A. So clearly, there are times where this is outside the core, quite close to the core, but it becomes where you want to go. And so, how are you thinking about the pipeline to M&A? To the point where is it part of your KPIs or is it intentionally not in your KPI?
So, as BMW, we have a quite clear strategy. We don't acquire our suppliers. Otherwise, we would have to acquire thousands of companies. So, in our case, we do not use it as a pipeline to M&A. But as mentioned before, tier one suppliers do use this as a pipeline to M&A. If you look into Infineon, they acquired a startup with a gallium nitride technology. Gun Systems was the name, I think. They acquired it like 2 years ago and they built up a new business branch with that.
And that was one you engaged with before.
Well, actually, the Avengers were invested in,
Okay.
and we also knew the startup quite well. And then it got acquired by Infineon, which made absolutely sense because it was not a competitor to the existing technologies. It was like a new product line for Infineon.
Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. And you mentioned earlier about a leaner process. So, engaging with a big company, especially if you're a supplier, typically comes with huge amount of paperwork, processes, and everything. But I watched one of your interview when you said, no, we need a leaner process. So can you speak to how you improve the onboarding of startups into BMW?
Yes, yes. So let's talk about the typical process first. So when you try to engage with a new supplier, you have to start a quite long supplier nomination process. You send out a request for information to possible suppliers. Then you define what you really want. You need at least three competitors. Then they all have to bid. Then let's say, then you try to find the supplier with the best offer, and then you can start the onboarding process. But doesn't work with startups because this process sometimes takes half a year or even longer. So for that reason, when we started our project or our program, we aligned with our purchasing. So we defined a special process that we have for startups. It's a special purchasing process. It's much faster than all the standard processes that we have. And I think what's most important is that we are able to do single sourcing. That means that when we look into a challenge and we scout for alternative solutions, we make sure that there is definitely no competitor that could fulfill the requirements of the business units.
Okay.
That that's how we actually legitimate, or that's how we argue when we say, okay, we are purchasing and single sourcing, because there's definitely no competitor out there. And that's why the selection process that we were talking about before is so important. You really have to make sure that you have the best startup. And yeah, and of course, we have a special contract because really the intellectual property. And we realized that in our typical contracts, you have to discuss intellectual property a lot. And that's why we said during the pilot projects, we don't touch any IP of the startup. The startup remains the owner, the user, and so on of the IP, so that we can just start and test. And if we decide afterwards, let's co develop a new technology, then we can talk or discuss about IP.
But that would be on top of the existing contract.
It would be after the pilot project, because if you start with long discussions regarding the IP, you will never find out if the startup is the right partner for you, but also from the startup perspective, you will not find out if it makes sense to discuss or to negotiate.
I get that, but I can imagine some business unit would say, wait, I'm going to share so much information before we even go to the POC. How do we handle IP? So, how do you manage the pushback that could come from business units?
So on the one hand, we have, of course, NDAs so that we can share information, but still, you're absolutely right. When we're doing pilot projects with our designers, they're not sharing the next designs of the next BMW prototypes. And actually, the easiest way is to say, okay, let's take artificial data sets, or let's take older data sets that are not that confidential anymore. And if this doesn't work, then it actually becomes much more complicated, because then our engineers require us to install, or the startup to install, let's say, the software on premise. And many startups have only a software as a service solutions. They have all solutions in the cloud. And actually, we already had to stop some projects because there was no way to proceed.
No match.
Because so if you are a founder and if you handle confidential data, you should have a software that is installable on premise.
Okay. Now, I want to go back to something you said, which is you're going to be the first customer, but not the last customer. And I can imagine many people thinking about venture clienting would be, but I want to have exclusivity for 3 years, or I want to have these special terms, or I want to have most preferred pricing. And then they start not to be able to engage with any startups because of that. Is there any best practice you want to share about how to engage with startups in a way where you're going to be able to be the first to innovate, but you're not suffocating the startup.
Yes, absolutely. So actually, it's similar to so many other suppliers. You know, the more customers your supplier has, the better the quality of the product. So
Mm.
if you have a small customer, like only BMW, and there are some software bugs, you have much less chances to identify those bugs than if you have more customers, like Audi, Mercedes, or whatever. If you're thinking about hardware, it actually your hardware gets cheaper if you have a higher volume. So there are many advantages of not doing exclusivity. But there are some situations, if you have, let's say, the most sustainable material and you want to communicate that, and that it's really a reason why people would buy a BMW instead of
Mm.
another car brand, then actually exclusivity becomes important as well. But also not forever, just for a couple of years, because it's the advantage of being the first on the market, selling a special feature. But after some time, you see that typical suppliers also offer the same product. And this is actually a challenge for startups as well. So I used to have a startup project which was actually it started good and they had a great technology, but it took them so long to integrate features and to industrialize their technology that existing tier one suppliers were able to develop the same. So also as a startup, you need to be aware that you have to stay ahead of your competitors, which are often tier one suppliers, not only for 1 or 2 years. You have to reinvent you again and again.
Now, if we think about venture clienting now, if you were to advise someone thinking about starting a venture clienting unit, what would be the top two, three challenges they have to think about ahead of starting?
Well, budget and capability is a topic
Mm.
because you need to do, I would say, at least 15 to 20 pilot projects every year to to show success. Because, as mentioned
Mm.
before, venture clienting takes time.
Yeah.
Most of the projects don't succeed, and it's a really small rate of projects that become successful after the pilot project.
What's the range, just to have a sense for
Mm,
it?
Well, I would say it's around 20%.
Okay, one in five.
Yes,
Yeah.
1 in 5. So, yeah, and if you have a venture clienting unit, of course, you need budget and you need to convince your management of giving you budget year and every year.
Yeah.
And for that reason, it's important to have like a minimum number of projects that are successful. So I wouldn't start too small. I would start rather big. That's advice number one. I would start with low hanging fruits, with startup technologies that are easy to integrate, they're kind of a no brainer, and that bring return on your investment. Because if you show that success, you make it interesting for others to engage, for other business units to engage, and for your management to support you. And number three is actually marketing and communication. So when I started at the BMW Startup Garage, I had a colleague who was doing only communication, and I was just like, why the hell do you need that? So turned out that even after 10 years of working within BMW and even after almost 300 projects, we have still so many departments and engineers that don't know us. And that's
Wow.
yeah, and that's so important to do events, to communicate about your successes, and yeah, to reach out to business units, to your internal customers. If you look into our LinkedIn, more than half of our followers are from BMW.
which is intentional.
Yes, absolutely. So you do external communication with the purpose of internal communication.
Yeah, no, I get that, which is not intuitive, but this is how you can
Oh,
reach people that follow LinkedIn, but they don't follow the newsletter inside the company.
never. So
Yeah.
who is using intranet?
So when you talked about marketing and communication, it's really towards the mothership employee.
Yes.
Okay. I love the golden nugget you shared about start big. Don't start too small. And I can see if it's 20% and you do 3 projects in a year, you might end up with no success. And then people will say, why do we even start it? So I think that's a very valuable advice to start big enough, to have enough POCs, to have enough successes. And then you have the discipline of low hanging fruit where probably at the beginning you try to tip more than the 20% you will get later because you can afford to take more risks.
Yes, that's the point.
Okay. Any more tidbits you want to share? Something that you learned the hard way, for example.
Well, I did a lot. So, what we had to learn at the beginning is that typically engineers are used to work with suppliers that know all the processes that we have, all the certifications, all the requirements. And at the beginning, we had some situations where the engineers were expecting that the startup knows all automotive processes, that they have all the certifications. They were like, okay, let's go, let's start. And this is the timeline. We're doing the supplier nomination, then we can start with the development. But then the purchasing comes and realizes you're not certified. The testing didn't, or you cannot prove that you tested your software and so on. And then it typically takes, you lose months or sometimes even a year until a startup gets all the certifications and or the approvals that it needs. So this is definitely a point. Also for cybersecurity or other governance topics, you need to align as early as possible so that you have no bad surprises.
I think for me, this is also one of the key value of a venture clienting unit is you're better prepared to help startups get prepared to engage with the mothership. You know what questions will come up. You can be very upfront. You can help them make sure that they've got all their to-do list before they engage, right?
And often it's not even that we do it on our own because the requirements of different business units are super different. So it's actually not even feasible for us to know all the requirements. But we bring the topic on the table, and that's what's important. And we make sure that the business units are aware that the startups maybe don't know the standard processes.
Now, one thing that comes up a lot is, of course, confidentiality. And you mentioned sometimes you need an NDA. When you sign an NDA with a startup, does it then protect both sides across all BMW, or is it just for you?
Across all BMW. So
Okay, that's a big deal.
yes, I mean we have like standard NDAs that make sure that we have the need to know principles. So even other parts of BMW don't have to know everything.
Okay. But at least you're protecting BMW's information, you're protecting the startup all across many, many engagements with just one NDA.
Well, for every project you need to set up a new NDA, but actually it's one standard NDA. And we have the same NDA with big suppliers and with startups as well.
That's a very good best practice. Now, one thing that I'm sure comes up a lot, and especially when you have new joiners in your team, is You want this collaboration to work. You've seen the need from the business unit. You find a startup that can match it, but you're not controlling that engagement. You can only be the catalyst, support, make sure that there's a good understanding, but you don't control it. How do you handle that?
Well, actually, I had to learn that if the business unit doesn't have a real need, then you cannot do anything about that. So what we make sure is actually at the beginning when we identify the challenges, then we really rather stress the business unit. We ask them about how big is your problem? Do you have any alternatives? What would be the impact of a solution? And if we realize that the problem is not really big, then actually we usually don't support that project because it's wasted time for the business unit and wasted time for the startup. And that's nothing that we want to support. But if the need is really big enough and the problem is urgent, then you don't have to control everything because then the
Mm.
business units are sometimes even faster than us. So when we sometimes, if the solution of the startup is really good and the problem is urgent, we realized by the end of the project that the business unit have prepared everything for the follow-up steps. They have secured the budget. They talked to the purchasing. So you need to have a good problem owner.
That's amazing. Is there any best practice in collecting the needs from the business unit, the business group? Do you have any best practice for people who are starting? Because it's not just about you go to the team and say, "What's your needs?" I'm sure you have some best practices to really get all of that insights.
Well, I think I have more not best practices. So we try a lot and I have bad practices.
Okay, share the bad practices then. What not to do.
What not to do. So if you just build up like a stand or just stand around on an internal event and try to collect internal challenges, forget it. So we tried. Our interns were working hard. They had like sweets and everything and games. Didn't work. Um, we sent emails. Didn't work as well. But it doesn't have to be the same for every company. That's really important to understand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But within BMW, there are too many emails, too many newsletters, so something doesn't work.
So it's back to people business.
Yes, yes, and what really helps is to get into the internal circles of the departments, but also not into big circles. Because if you have an audience of 500 people and you ask them, "Hey, do you have a problem?" If you have a problem, then approach us. Nobody will approach you.
Mm-mm.
Um, but if you go let's say, into a circle where you have a mix of management and also of the tech guys, of the problem owners, then that's what works for us. So I typically go into a circle where I assume that they might have challenges that might be solved by startups. Then I do a short introduction round, like 5, maximum 10 minutes. And the rest of the time we spend with the technology topics, with startups that might help them. We're discussing challenges. So we dive really deep into their problems. And that's the way that you can collect challenges the best. So not too broad audience, it should be small enough, and the
Yep.
people shouldn't be only managers because managers typically are not on the level of the problem owners. It's typically an engineer.
Which basically means that out of the 100 plus teams you engage with, it's probably 300 people easily you need to get to know with good level of intimacy.
Absolutely. I mean, it comes with the time. So the Startup Garage is 10 years old. And of course, many know us and it gets easier. But yeah, you
Mhm.
have to approach the people personally.
So, Alex, my last question is going to be about the future. And I see venture clienting starting to really professionalize and grow and spread, especially in Europe. What do you think venture clienting will look like 10 years from now?
Well, they're different. So actually, I have two hypotheses, and I'm not really sure what it's gonna be. So actually, when I started working for the Startup Garage, my goal was that nobody would need me in 10 years.
Design yourself out of the job.
Yes, exactly. I had the idea that every engineer will work with startups, that we have a lean purchasing process for everyone, that will be able to scout the solution and so on. That was my idea, but actually the reality is still it's a people business, and you have to provide the service within the company,
Mm.
at least for now. I can imagine, or I could imagine that this gonna be better, or maybe in 10 years. But still, I think that this will remain a people business, and it's all about building trust. And you also have to build trust to a startup as well, and that's what venture client units like ours are for. And yeah, what I also see, actually, I was thinking that in the US, every company works with startups. What I'm learning now is actually they're not. They're investing a lot, but they don't have that venture clienting process, and they actually don't work with startups that much. Many companies like Apple acquire startups, but still it's a different process. So I think that this will become bigger and much easier for startups to scale internationally, to get into new business opportunities, and to sell their products.
Alex, thank you for ending with such a good double hypothesis, which is really interesting. I always love when people think about how they could design themselves out of a job. And of course, if you can't, it means that it's really valuable to do. So I really thank you for your time, sharing your insights, being so candid, including on the journey and the challenges along the way. It was really, really insightful.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, Nicolas. I really enjoyed it. I look at the clock, and I'm surprised how fast the time passed. It was really fun, and yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.